Hi and welcome to Worlds Apart, a program that is committed to speaking the truth in love. I'm your host, Ruolo, and today we have with us Jay Smith, who'll be speaking to us about ideologies that are worlds apart. Welcome to the show, Jay.
Hey, thanks, Ruolo. It's good to be here.
Excellent. It's always a pleasure to have you here. What I would like to speak about today is the role or function of women in the family, but specifically from the Quran, and then we can compare it to the Bible.
Right.
If I can ask you the first question, we know from the scriptures, from the Bible that is, that God has created us, both man and woman, in His image.
Yeah.
Is there a similar concept in the Quran?
No, and this is one of the reasons why many Muslims get confused concerning what's so special. And this goes right back to the very beginning. For Rommel, right back to the very beginning of Genesis, we need to go back to that first chapter, verse 26 and 27 of Genesis 1, where God says, "Let us," plural, "create man in our image," plural, "in His image," singular, He created man. So we have everything God has. We have all the same imageness. That's why I know I love. That's why I know I can sacrifice. That's why I can understand why I'm different than the other animals, because we're created in God's image uniquely. There's nothing like that in the Quran. There's no reference whatsoever that comes close to that. And that's why Muslims have such a difficult time understanding how God could become a man. We're so corruptible. We're so different as far as Muslims concerned. God is so totally other, totally unique, must stay totally distant. He dare not come to earth because then He would be corruptible, which says something about their theology, that God in coming to earth, He would become corruptible. They have a pretty weak God if He becomes corruptible. And that's why it's fascinating that I love to go back and say our imageness shows us something unique about us. Yes, we are corruptible because of choice. It is a choice we made. But if God were to come to earth and be a man, and what would be the one problem? Muslims always say the one problem is that corruption. So I always say, theoretically speaking, then you have no problem. If God could come and still not be corrupted, you'd have no problem, would you? Bingo.
That's
We'll
right.
get into that in another talk that we're going to do. But let's talk about this idea of man and woman being made in God's image.
Well, that was my next question to you. Are men and women equal in the Quran? Because we certainly do understand that from the Bible.
What you will hear from Muslims today, and there are many Muslims in the West, I find fascinating in living in London that we have a lot of very well-educated women come up to me and they say all the time, "Jay, please don't say that I'm unequal because I wear the burqa or the jilbab or the niqab or the purda or the hijab," all these different names they give for these coverings, sometimes whole, sometimes just the head. This doesn't make me unequal. In fact, I feel honored. I feel honored by being a woman in Islam. Islam ennobles me. And I say, that may be the case living in the West. And I would say that they would feel ennobled because they're wearing a dress code that identifies them as separate. I think they're confusing the issue there. But living in the West is not a good example of Islam. To understand Islam, you need to go back to the Quran. To define any Muslim, you need to come back to this book, because this is what defines what a woman is. And it's what this book says about women that Muslim women need to listen to. I would say the reason why Muslim women living in the West feel ennobled is because they live in the West. We ennoble them. It's the West and the standards and how they are treated. The fact that they cannot be beaten here is what ennobles them. And they're not realizing that. But one other thing I always do, I always say, I want you to go to 6 verses. Now, these are 6 verses I'm going to give you right now. And I want you people who are watching this on the screen, I want you to open your Quran, or if you don't have a Quran with you, write these 6 verses, especially if you're women. This is for you. I'm going to go to 2 different surahs. I'm going to go to Surah 4 and Surah 2. And I'm going to go to 4 verses in Surah 4 and 2 verses in Surah 2. Make it nice and simple. I'm going to look at those verses, and I want you Muslims, especially you Muslim women, to look at these verses and then help me understand why these verses are there, but what it says about you. Let's start with Surah 4, Ayah 3. In Book 4, verse 3, it says that a man can have up to 4 wives. Now, interesting, it doesn't say a woman can have up to 4 husbands. Thank God. I don't think many women would want 4 husbands. I think one of us is bad enough. But it certainly says that a man can have up to 4 wives, which already in marriage shows inequality. That man can have up to 4 wives, not the other way around.
Why 4?
Well, obviously, that's a question you need to ask Muslims. Because Muhammad didn't respond to that. Muhammad had 12.
Really?
So he didn't even fit his own revelation. He went way beyond what the revelation said, which says something about the Prophet himself. What prophet never lives under his own revelation. But certainly, why for? I think that's as much as they could handle. Because it does say if they can treat them equally. Can you know of any man that can treat 4 women equally?
Nah.
So in and of itself, it seems to be impossible. Then why even have this injunction in Surah 4, Ayah 3? It's there, I think, to show that men are superior to women, and it shows that in marriage there is a second-class category for women. In verse 11, which is just a few verses later, in chapter 4, verse 11, it says that women are given half the inheritance of men. Half the inheritance? Why? That doesn't make sense either.
Right, yeah.
So at death, women, especially girls, if their father dies, the girl gets half of what her brother gets. Or 2 girls get the same as 1 boy. So you see in marriage, you see in death, women are second class. They're beneath men. In verse 24, it talks about those women that your right hand possesseth. Now, that's what they say in English. In Arabic, it's very clear these are prisoners of war. Any woman that is caught as a prisoner of war becomes the property of the man.
Really?
Which means he can have as many of them that he wants, above and beyond the 4 wives.
Is that like spoils of war or something?
Spoils of war.
Okay.
Not that women can have men. Nowhere does it say women can have that as many men as the right hand possesseth. Oh, this is only for men. Only men can have as many women.
Street, yes.
These are basically concubines. As many as your right hand possesseth. It's right there in Scripture. And even if those women have children, their children have the same inheritance that of a real wife. So they're given the same privileges as a real wife's child. So a man can have up to 4 wives, but as many concubines on top of that. Now, how can that be equal?
It's not.
It's not.
Can I stop you there, Bart?
We're going to go on, but go ahead. Let's stop and start with
I want to stop you there because perhaps a Muslim will turn around and say, well, at least it's limited. But if you were to go to the Bible, I mean, there were multiple marriages there. If you look at the case of Solomon, of David had 100 wives, Solomon 700, and there are many other prophets that are mentioned that had multiple wives there. So surely the example that's in the Bible advocates or endorses the example that's in the Quran.
You need to go right to the back to the very beginning. You need to go to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, at the very beginning, look what God intended. God said, for man shall leave his mother, and the 2 shall become one.
Yes.
1 woman for 1 man for life. That was the institution that God gave at the very beginning. Now people start falling away. We know that Abraham didn't have just 1 wife. He also had a concubine, right. Hagar, but he had about 3 other wives, 4 wives in all. That we know that Abraham had. We know that David had multiple wives. We know that Solomon had an enormous amount of wives, hundreds. So obviously people left God's injunctions.
Okay.
So then we come back to the New Testament, and it's very clear in 1 Timothy 3, verse 2, chapter 3, verse 2. Paul says to Timothy, a leader of the church must have only 1 wife. That which God instituted at the very beginning, Paul then brings back to fruition in the New Testament. So in the Bible, it's very clear that a man of God, see, this is a man of God, must only have 1 wife. What God had intended, Jesus Christ then reenacted and brought back to fruition. So in Christianity, we have wedding rings. I see you have a wedding ring on, I have a wedding ring on. This commits me to 1 wife for life. So it elevates the whole institution of marriage where it belongs. That's why I love what Christ did. Christ elevated marriage, showed that this is something God had intended from the very beginning. This is what God had made man and woman for, that the 2 should separate from their parents and the 2 become 1. That's why when weddings, many times you take 2 candles, you bring them together, and they make 1 candle. And the fire from that 1 candle becomes 1 candle, you blow out these other 2. Because you no longer are separate, now you're together as 1. Wow. And that stays to life.
That's right.
It is only broken by death. Proving that the whole institution of marriage is that important, it's that solid. And there have been studies after studies, you know this as well as I do, Rommel, that studies after studies have shown here in modern day that the children of families that do not get divorced are the most stable children. They do the best in education. They do the best in later life. Why? Because that stability in marriage. So that it seems to be coming around. Even the secular world is realizing that what we have instituted in the Bible, what God instituted at the very beginning, what Jesus then reenacted and Paul then solidified there in 1 Timothy 3:2, is what God had intended right back in Genesis 2, verse 24. Now, let's go on then to come back to the Quran again. We've already talked about in marriage there's inequality. We talked about in death there's inequality. We talked about concubinage. Let's go to 10 verses after that, from 24 to verse 34. Surah 4, verse 34. It says there that men are the protectors of women. But to those women who dishonor you, those women who stand against you, admonish them first. Naughty, naughty, don't do it again. If that doesn't work, it says, then throw her from the bed. Wow. Now that's a pretty serious thing, is it not?
Not to sleep next to her, yeah.
Well, not to let her share your bed anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
Why is that serious, Rommel? Well, the reason is very simple. Back in the time of the 7th century, what was the status of a woman? What was basically her identity was wrapped up in two really duties. She was to take care of her husband and is to bear children. That's all that she was to do. So if you throw her from the bed, you've taken away her childbearing possibilities, which eradicates her identity. That's hugely serious. So first you admonish them. Then it says, if that doesn't work, you throw her from the bed. If that doesn't work, what does it say? You then beat her.
You beat her.
Daraba. Now you speak Arabic. What does daraba mean?
Yeah, to hit. That's right.
To
beat
scourge.
Her. Yeah.
It's, you know, in the English language, we have the word drubbing. Comes from that word, daraba, drubbing. That's where we get it from the root daraba. Which is interesting because Muslims, if you look in the Quran, it says lightly in parentheses. Now, is there any reference to lightly in the Quran?
No.
Absolutely not. I remember doing a debate at the Cambridge Union with Dr. Azam Tamimi. Dr. Azam Tamimi is head of the Hamas party in Britain. Very charismatic individual. He's on television quite often. He represents the Hamas party. And I asked him to exegete Surah 4, Ayah 34. Yeah, don't worry about it, Mr. Smith. This is the last of 3 injunctions. It's the very last thing. It's the final thing you must do. And besides, you must just tap her on the shoulder. I said, hold on a minute. Hold on. Stop here. You first admonish her. That doesn't work. So then you throw her from the bed, which is basically destroys her identity. That doesn't work. Then you just tap her on the shoulder. And there's laughter all through the hall. But then he did a very stupid thing, or maybe not a very clever thing. He then turned to me, says, okay, it does mean beating. You're right, it does mean beating. He says, but, you know, I know many women that love to be beaten.
Oh, my goodness.
You do not say that at the Cambridge Union. You do not say that at the Cambridge Union. And there was a gasp in the audience when he said that. Because in Britain, and I'm sure the same way as in Australia or anywhere in the Western world where we have the Bible as our injunction, we do not beat women. We do not do that because the Bible is very clear that we must love them. Now, we'll come back to that, what the Bible says on that. But I want to finish with the last two. Let's go to Surah 2, and let's go to Surah 280, Ayah 282. So Surah 2, verse 282. It says that a woman has half the testimony in court of a man. Half the testimony. Now, Aisha, the favorite wife of Muhammad, who is interesting, one of his 12 wives, she was his favorite wife. Remember, he married her when she was 7 years old and then consummated the marriage when she was 9 years old. And he was 53 at the time. I'm 57. Can you imagine a man of my age marrying a 9-year-old girl? Yeah. That's the example that we see in the Quran. Not in the Quran, with Muhammad himself. But his favorite wife, Aisha, when she came across this verse, she comes to Muhammad and asks him, why is it that women are given half the testimony? And his answer is very clear. He says, because women are more disobedient and less intelligent.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how that makes you feel. I don't know how it makes you women feel who are watching this. But stop and think and ask, is that relevant for today in the 21st century? In Britain, where I live, today, by the time of high school age, when girls reach the age of high school, which is around 15, 16 years of age, girls outperform boys in every category. In every area of school, they outperform boys, even in science and math. The last 2 categories that we had as men have now been surpassed by women. And by the time they get to college age, university age, university graduates in Britain, 70% of all university graduates are women.
Wow. 70%.
70%. You cannot tell me in the 21st century that women are less intelligent. In the 7th century, maybe. In the 7th century, where they were denigrated, where they were kept down, where they were not permitted to go to school, where they were not permitted to have the freedoms that we have today, possibly they were less intelligent. Not less intelligent, they were just not as academic. But you cannot say that in the 21st century. Thank God we don't have those kind of verses. I want to end with the last verse before I go to the Bible. Because the very last verse is the one of the hardest ones. Surah 2, Ayah 223. In Surah 2, Ayah 223, it says, your women are a tilth for you, so go to your tilth as ye will. Your women are a tilth for you. Now what is tilth? Well, when you plow a field, you make a till. You till the field. You plow it and you bring it up. You plow it and you bring it up. So it says in verse 223, your women are those that you plow. Go to them and plow them anytime you will. has huge sexual connotations. Because basically what it's saying is basically you can go into them sexually anytime you want. It's a horrendous verse. And I don't know how women who are watching this feel about this. We've asked many women down at Speaker's Corner on university campuses, we've asked them to try to come and help us to understand that verse. Because it's just the image of it shows that women are nothing more than properties for men. Nothing more than a property for men.
Do Muslim women that you engage with understand it?
They have no idea they didn't even know that verse is there.
Wow.
Many times whenever we talk to Muslim women, they say that verse is not in the Quran. When they open it, when they read it, they say, well, you've written it, Mr. Smith. Why would I waste my time writing the Quran?
That's right.
I said, listen, don't trust me. Go back to your own Quran. Go back to your own house and read it. And then you come back to me next week and tell me, how is it you can support that? How can a woman be seen as a tilth for her husband? That a man can plow sexually anytime he wants? Thank God we don't have these kind of verses. When I come back and I ask, what does Jesus do with women? Oh, I love the example of Jesus Christ. There's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet. Martha is in the kitchen. Martha comes to Mary and says, come on back. And Jesus says, no, Martha, you go back in the kitchen. Mary, you stay right here. Now, what was Jesus doing? Here was a rabbi allowing a woman to sit at a rabbi's feet, which is unheard of in Judaism. And he was turning 1,000 years of tradition on its head.
Wow.
That's my Jesus. Oh, I love that. And what about equality? Look at Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There's no difference between Jew or Greek, slave or free, man or woman. All are equal in Jesus Christ.
That's right.
You can't get a better verse than that. And as you look at Jesus' example, it's fascinating when you look at the stories, the parables that he says. Many times in his parables, he equates the church and himself as a husband and a wife. Many times he talks about the family structure to explain his parables. In Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25, it's probably the best place where Paul talks and uses Jesus and quotes Jesus and saying where Jesus equates himself to the church as a husband to a bride. And as Jesus is willing to love the church, so much so that he's willing to die for the church, so a husband should be willing to die for his wife. Ooh, what a corrective to Surah 4, ayah 34.
And that's such a high standard for Christians.
It's a huge standard.
You know?
It's a huge standard. And what about the testimony? Half of the testimony? No.
No.
Look at the greatest event in the whole history of mankind. What is it the whole Bible is pointing to? Every prophet is pointing to one event that's going to happen. The Messiah is going to come. He's going to die and he's going to rise again. The resurrection of God. The resurrection of Jesus Christ in the form of God in the form of a man. That resurrection is the highest event in the whole history of mankind. Who does Jesus show himself to?
Women.
Absolutely. In fact, one woman.
Yeah.
He doesn't go to any men. He doesn't even go to his disciples who he had spent 3 years with. You'd think he'd go to the disciple. No, he waited for a woman, Mary, to come to the tomb. And he showed himself to her first, knowing that her testimony would be half of that of a man, because that was the tradition there in Judaism in the first century. Knowing that, he purposely showed himself to a woman, knowing that the greatest event in the whole history of mankind would have to come from a woman. And the second time he showed himself was to a group of women on the way to Bethany. That's my Jesus. I love the Bible because it's a corrective to what we see here. We don't have any verses like this in the Bible that we see in the Quran.
What about the Samaritan woman?
Look at the Samaritan woman. But look at what he did to her. Not only did he explain who she was, not only he talked about her sins, he forgave her on the spot. And he went to someone outside his Jewish traditions and he was able to give words of knowledge. That's my Jesus. He ennobled her. And so much so that she went running back in the village and says, come and see this man who knows everything that I've done. He didn't say everything that she had done, but the fact that he could know so much of that was intimate to her, the most intimate details of her life, showed that he honored her, showed that he not only honored her, but that he was willing to come to her as an outcast and ennoble her as a result.
That's right. So how does the Quran see divorce? I mean, in the Bible, I mean, it's a horrible thing. It's a terrible thing. As you mentioned, you know, God's brought them together, man and woman, forever, you know, to stay together, you know, for life. So how does the Quran see divorce?
Divorce is assumed, and it's very easy in the Quran. And to understand divorce, you need to go to Surah 2. In Surah 2, it's very clear that a man can divorce his wife anytime he wants to, basically just by saying 3 times, talak, talak, talak. That's it.
Divorce.
That's it. That's all he has to do. He doesn't have to have any reason. He doesn't have to have any motivation. For no reason he can divorce her. He just is displeased with her, he can divorce her. There is no injunction against a man or a stipulation as to when or where a man needs to divorce. For a woman, she has to go to arbitration to an Islamic court. Wow. She has to, which is made up of only men. And she has to argue her case in front of these men. And then once she has argued these cases in front of these men, if they decide that they should be divorced, then they will. But 90% of the time that we have seen in the UK at Islamic courts, which are now legal in Britain, at these courts, women are not permitted to divorce their husband. They must stay with them, because most of the scholars, most Islamic scholars believe it's the woman's fault why this man is upset. Now, so divorce is very easy for a man. It's very difficult for a woman. But there's no view like we have in Christianity that they stay married for life. But here's the really tragic thing. Let's say that a man divorces his wife because they had an argument, or she stayed too long at her relatives, or she burned the food for any reason. Let's just say he gets upset with her. They have an argument. He says, "I divorce you. I divorce you." If he says it a third time, it's too late. They must be divorced. Then he wakes up the next morning. He goes to sleep. Wakes up the next morning and realizes, "Oh, what have I done? I shouldn't have divorced her." He really does love her. How can he take her back?
I don't know.
In Surah 2, Ayah 230, you have the answer. In Surah 2, Ayah 230, and I'll just read it for you right here. In Surah 2, Ayah 230, "And if he divorces her, then she is not lawful to him thereafter until she has married another husband."
She has to get married again.
She has to get married, and that has to be consummated. That has to be consummated before he can take her back.
What do you mean?
Well, it means they have to have sex. They have to have sexual intercourse.
Oh, wow.
So basically, a man, if he divorces his wife, according to the Quran, and then he realizes he's done the wrong thing, he really does love her, he wants to take her back, according to the Quran, he has to go find a friend to marry her, they have to have sexual intercourse, and only then can he take her back in marriage. Now, to me, that's horrendous, because that shows me that a woman is nothing more than basically a sexual object for men to play with, to dally and dilly around. We have a friend, my cousin has a friend in Pakistan, and he is an imam, and his whole job there in Pakistan is to marry these divorced women and have sex with them so that the husbands can take them back. That's his sole responsibility. And, even he sees the problem with this. And I think this is tragic, because it shows women as nothing more than chattel. Chattel for men. And it's straight out of the Quran. You can't argue with the Quran. And that's why when Muslims want to argue this, I take them to Surah 2. And I ask them to explain that verse to me. Chapter 2, verse 223 is bad enough. Chapter 2, verse 230 is even worse in the context of marriage. Because it says to me marriage is nothing more than sexual intercourse. No, my marriage is much more than sex with my wife. My goodness, the fact I have this ring and the fact that this dedicates me and commits me to her for life shows to me that she is much more than just a bearer of my children. She is also my helpmate. She's my co-worker. She's my best friend. She's what I like to go out and spend time with, alone and yes, with other friends. And that makes her equal with me. And yes, what the beautiful thing is, my body is the same as hers. And I love to go to 1 Corinthians. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 to 40, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 to 40, it's such a corrective to Surah 2, Ayah 223, and Surah 2, Ayah 230. Because it says that a man's body is equal to his wife's body, and a woman's body is equal to her husband's body, and the two of them should share their bodies as one. Oh, I love that. Because it shows me that I have no right over my wife's body any more than she has a right over mine. And that I'm to love and cherish her for life. That's not only a corrective, that's how God had made us, and that's how God had intended. And that's the type of marriage, and that's the type of wedding, and that's also our view of women that I want Muslims to see. I want you Muslims to see this, because if you want to look at those 6 verses that I just gave you, try to come up with any answers to those verses, but then don't just stop there, go beyond that, and say to yourself, do you really feel that this book ennobles women? Does it really ennoble women? There are many Muslims that feel ennobled because they're not following this book. And living in the West, in Australia or in the UK, they follow many of the precepts that we are giving them. The whole idea of marriage, the fact that a woman has a choice in that marriage, that is uniquely Christian. Did you know that? Because when Christianity was birthed in the 1st century, that was not the ideal for marriage. No. Marriage in the 1st century was basically Greek or Roman marriage. And in Greek and Roman marriage, the highest relationship was between a man and another man. Seen as the highest relationship.
Wow.
Women were only seen as basically bearers of children. Therefore, the marriage contact was seen as more of a convenience, and in some cases an inconvenience. If a man fell in love with his wife, he was seen as mildly insane. Men were not supposed to fall in love with women. They were supposed to fall in love with other men. And that's why homosexuality was rampant in the first century. Pederasty. When you went to school as a little boy, you would be given to your scholar, and in payment for his schooling would be to lay with him. The students would lay with the teacher in a sexual relationship, boy with man, to pay off their fees. Pederasty was rampant. Christianity came into the world and stopped all that cold. Elevated the whole relationship of a man and wife as God had intended from Genesis 2, verse 24, went back to that ideal, showed that marriage was something that was between a man and a woman, not only for life, but a man must love his wife as Christ loved the church in Ephesians 5:25, and brought back the whole institution of marriage as the way it was intended by God. Now, there are many Muslims that like that idea of marriage, and they're coming back to it, but they can't find it in this book. The only place you can come back to it is this book.
The Bible.
Come on home.
Yes.
Come on home. For true marriage, for true view of women, this is the book to come to.
Excellent. Thank you very much once again for discussing these topics. I mean, they're central topics. I don't think they're only just central just for Muslims and Christians, but it's central for anyone that's listening to this episode. Thank you once again. If I can just turn to our viewers and say thank you for watching this episode. I pray and hope that you found it informative. Please stay in tune for the very next episode, and may the Lord bless you. Thank you and goodbye.